In a quiet corner of Millbrook Heights, where forgotten dreams still find a way to bloom, miracles happen in the most unexpected places. David Fowler's weathered hands had guided countless fingers across the raised dots of Braille for the past 5 years, but nothing prepared him for the moment two 7-year-old twins would appear at his cramped apartment door, forever changing the course of 3 lives. What began as a desperate single father's way to make ends meet would catch the attention of Victoria Sterling, one of the most powerful tech moguls in the world, and the twins' estranged mother. But could a man who'd lost everything help bridge a gap between a broken family and heal wounds that money couldn't touch? Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below, and if this story moves you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have something even more extraordinary to share with you. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of David Fowler's third-floor apartment, casting gentle shadows across the small living room that doubled as his teaching space. At 38, David's once confident stride had been replaced by the careful movements of a man who navigated the world primarily through sound and touch. The accident 3 years ago hadn't just taken his sight. It had taken his career as a construction foreman, his savings, and eventually his wife's patience with their new reality. But it hadn't taken his determination. "Good morning, sunshine," David called softly to his 8-year-old daughter Lucy, who was already awake and organizing her Braille books by the window. Lucy had been born with a rare genetic condition that gradually stole her vision, but she possessed a brightness that seemed to illuminate every corner of their modest home. "Morning, Dad," Lucy replied, her fingers dancing across the pages of her favorite story. "Mrs. Patterson from 2B wants to know if you can teach her grandson Braille. He's starting to lose his vision, too." David smiled, carefully making his way to the small kitchenette, where he prepared their simple breakfast. Word had spread throughout the Riverside apartments about his unofficial tutoring services. What had started as a necessity, teaching himself and Lucy to read Braille after they'd both lost their sight, had evolved into something more meaningful. Parents, grandparents, and caregivers from across Millbrook Heights now climbed the narrow stairs to apartment 3C, seeking hope in the form of raised dots and patient instruction. "Tell Mrs. Patterson we'll make room," David said, buttering Lucy's toast with practiced precision. Everyone deserves to find their way back to reading. The apartment itself told the story of their journey. The walls were lined with handmade Braille labels that David had created using a borrowed Braille writer. Everything from Lucy's books to emergency candles had been meticulously marked. A donated folding table served as their classroom, surrounded by mismatched chairs that neighbors had contributed over the months. The coffee table displayed an impressive collection of Braille learning materials, most of them created by David himself, using techniques he'd learned from YouTube videos and library books during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. "Dad," Lucy said, pausing in her reading, "that lady called again yesterday while you were at the grocery store. The one with the fancy voice." David's hand stilled on the coffee mug. For the past week, someone had been calling about private Braille instruction for her children. Twins, she'd said, who'd lost their sight in an accident. The voice had been crisp, professional, with the kind of confidence that spoke of boardrooms and business deals. She'd offered generously to pay for David's services, but something in her tone had made him hesitate. There was a desperation underneath the polish, a vulnerability that reminded him of his own darkest days. "What did she say this time?" David asked, settling into his favorite chair, a threadbare recliner that had been left behind by the previous tenant. "She said she really needs your help, that her children have been struggling for months, and their regular teachers aren't—" Lucy paused, trying to remember the exact words. "Aren't connecting with their specific needs, I think she said." David nodded thoughtfully. He'd received similar calls before, wealthy families seeking quick solutions to complex challenges. But most of them expected miracles without understanding that learning Braille was as much about building confidence and independence as it was about reading raised dots. They wanted their children fixed, not taught to thrive in a different way of experiencing the world. The morning routine continued with comfortable familiarity. David helped Lucy prepare for her day at the Millbrook Institute for the Blind, where she attended classes with other visually impaired children. The school's transportation service would arrive at 8:30, giving them just enough time for breakfast and their daily review of yesterday's lessons. Remember, Braille isn't about replacing what you've lost. It's about discovering what you've gained, a new way to explore stories, to learn, to connect with words and ideas. It was the same message he shared with every student who climbed those 3 flights of stairs to his makeshift classroom. Whether it was elderly Mr. Rodriguez, whose diabetes had affected his vision, or teenage Amanda, who'd been struggling with her new reality after a car accident, David's approach never varied. Patience, encouragement, and the fundamental belief that everyone could find their own path forward. The phone rang just as Lucy's transportation van pulled up outside. David made his way to the old rotary phone, one of the few appliances in their apartment that he found easier to navigate than modern alternatives. "David Fowler?" he answered simply.
"Mr. Fowler, this is Victoria Sterling." The voice was indeed as polished as Lucy had described, but David detected something else now. Exhaustion, perhaps even defeat. "I've been trying to reach you about my children. They're 7 years old, twins, and they need help." "What kind of help are you looking for, Miss Sterling?" David asked, settling back into his chair as he heard Lucy's cheerful goodbye and the sound of the van pulling away. There was a long pause before Victoria continued. "My children lost their sight in an accident 6 months ago. Since then, they've had the best teachers, the most expensive equipment, the finest rehabilitation specialists that money can buy. But they're not responding. They've retreated into themselves, and I'm afraid I'm losing them entirely." David had heard variations of this story before, but something in Victoria's voice made him listen more carefully. "What makes you think I might be able to help when specialists haven't succeeded?" "Because," Victoria said, her professional facade cracking slightly, "you understand. You've been where they are. And frankly, Mr. Fowler, you're the only teacher they haven't met who comes with personal experience rather than just professional training." As David listened to Victoria describe her children, Emma and Ethan, their withdrawal from activities they'd once loved, their resistance to learning adaptive techniques, he found himself thinking about Lucy's own journey, the fear, the anger, the gradual acceptance, and finally the joy of rediscovering the world through different senses. "I'd be willing to meet with them," David said finally, "but I should tell you up front, I'm not a miracle worker. I'm just a father who learned Braille alongside his daughter, and I teach from my apartment. If you're looking for a polished rehabilitation facility, there are better options." "Mr. Fowler," Victoria said quietly, "polished facilities are exactly what haven't worked. Maybe what my children need is something real." As David hung up the phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation would somehow change everything. He moved to the window, listening to the familiar sounds of Millbrook Heights waking up, children playing in the courtyard below, the distant hum of traffic, the cheerful chatter of neighbors beginning their day. He had no way of knowing that Victoria Sterling's name graced the Forbes Billionaire list, or that her tech empire had revolutionized digital accessibility worldwide. He simply heard a mother's desperation and a father's love for children who needed someone to believe in their potential. The ordinary Thursday morning continued around him, but David Fowler's life was about to become anything but ordinary. 3 years earlier, David Fowler had been a different man entirely. As the lead construction foreman for Hartwell Construction, he commanded respect on job sites across the state, his keen eye for detail and unwavering safety standards making him one of the most sought-after supervisors in the industry. At 35, he had everything mapped out: a thriving career, a comfortable suburban home in Oakenfield Estates, and a future that seemed as solid as the foundations he helped build. Safety first, profit second was David's motto, a philosophy that had earned him both admiration from his crews and occasional friction with management, focused on tight deadlines and tighter budgets. His wife Rebecca used to tease him about his meticulous nature, the way he'd triple-check every measurement, every safety protocol, every detail that others might overlook. But David knew that in construction, imperfection could cost lives. It was a lesson that he'd learned from his own father, who'd spent 40 years building bridges and had never had a single safety incident on his watch. "Measure twice, cut once," the old man used to say, "and always, always look out for your crew." The morning of March 15th had started like any other. David arrived at the Riverside Commerce Center project before dawn, reviewing the day's schedule and checking weather conditions. The crew was installing steel beams on the 7th floor, routine work for experienced professionals, but requiring absolute attention to detail. David had personally inspected every safety harness, every cable, every piece of equipment. He should have been in the project trailer, reviewing architectural changes that had come through the night before, but something had nagged at him about the northeast corner of the building, where newer crew members were working alongside veterans. It was just a feeling, the kind of instinct that had kept his sites accident-free for a decade. "Johnson," David had called to his assistant foreman, "I'm going up to check the corner connections. Something doesn't feel right about the wind shear calculations in this morning's report." The investigation had revealed exactly what David's instincts had warned him about, a potential failure point in the temporary bracing system that could have collapsed an entire section under the building's current wind load. As he worked to identify the specific issue, coordinating with his team to safely evacuate the affected area, the unthinkable happened. Not where he was looking for problems, but in a section that had been deemed completely secure. A delivery crane operator, rushing to meet an aggressive schedule, had exceeded the boom's rated capacity while attempting to place materials on the 10th floor. The overloaded crane buckled, sending a cascade of steel beams crashing down through 7 floors of incomplete structure.
David had seen it happening in what felt like slow motion. Tons of steel and debris falling toward where Tommy Martinez, a 23-year-old father of 2, was securing anchor points. Without thinking, David had lunged forward, shoving Tommy clear of the impact zone, just as a massive beam struck the exact spot where the young man had been standing. The beam that saved Tommy's life had crushed David's future in an instant. When David woke up 3 weeks later in Millbrook General Hospital, the world had literally gone dark. Traumatic brain injury from the impact had damaged his optic nerves beyond repair. But the physical blindness was only the beginning of his losses. "You're a hero," Rebecca had said during one of her increasingly rare visits to his hospital room. "Tommy's wife wants to name their new baby after you. The company is calling you a hero." But David didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man whose entire identity had been built around seeing problems before they happened, and now he couldn't see anything at all. The insurance settlement was substantial, enough to cover medical expenses and provide some financial security. The company had offered him a consultant position, reviewing safety protocols from behind a desk. Everyone expected him to be grateful for surviving, grateful for the recognition, grateful for the support. Instead, David fell into a darkness deeper than his physical blindness. "I can't do this anymore," Rebecca had finally admitted 6 months after the accident. Lucy, then 5 years old, had been David's only source of light during those black months. But even his daughter's unconditional love couldn't bridge the growing chasm between David and the life he'd lost. "You're not the same person," Rebecca continued, her voice breaking with exhaustion and grief. "I married a man who fixed things, who protected people, who saw solutions. Now you won't even try to learn how to navigate the kitchen without help." The divorce papers had arrived on the same day David received Lucy's diagnosis. The genetic condition that would gradually steal his daughter's sight had been dormant, undetectable, until stress triggered its progression. The doctors explained that Lucy's emotional trauma from the family's upheaval, combined with her genetic predisposition, had accelerated the condition's onset. "This is my fault," David had whispered to his sister Caroline during one of her visits. "My accident broke our family, and now it's breaking Lucy too." "Stop it," Caroline had said firmly. "You saved a man's life. You gave Tommy Martinez a chance to see his children grow up. That matters, David." But knowing he'd helped one family couldn't ease the guilt of watching his own daughter face the same darkness he'd been struggling to navigate. When Rebecca moved to California to start fresh, taking most of their savings and leaving David with minimal custody, he'd been forced to confront a terrifying reality. He was a blind man who would soon be caring for a blind child, and he had no idea how to take care of either of them. The first year had been brutal. David's pride prevented him from accepting most offers of help, and his inexperience with blindness led to countless small disasters: burned meals, missed appointments, bills that went unpaid because he couldn't read them. Lucy's condition progressed slowly, giving her time to adjust, but also creating a strange situation where she often became his guide even as her own vision deteriorated. "Daddy," 6-year-old Lucy had said one evening after a particularly frustrating day of struggled independence, "why don't we learn together?" She'd been holding a children's book about Helen Keller that her teacher had sent home, her small fingers tracing the pictures she could still partially see. "This lady learned to read with her fingers. Maybe we could too." That night, for the first time since the accident, David had felt something other than despair. Lucy's simple suggestion had planted a seed that would eventually bloom into purpose. Learning Braille alongside his daughter became more than just a survival skill, it became a journey back to himself. The process was humbling for a man who'd once memorized complex blueprints and building codes. His construction-roughened fingers struggled with the subtle differences between dot patterns. The reading pace that had once helped him quickly scan safety reports was now measured in individual letters, then words, then gradually sentences. But as David and Lucy progressed together, something remarkable happened. His daughter's natural adaptability, combined with his systematic approach to problem-solving, creating a learning environment that was both patient and efficient. "We're a good team, Daddy," Lucy had said one evening as they worked through a particularly challenging passage together. "Yes, we are, sweetheart," David had replied, and for the first time in over a year, he'd meant it. By the time they moved to the Riverside apartments, a step down financially, but a step up in terms of community support, David had discovered something unexpected. Teaching Lucy had awakened abilities he didn't know he possessed. His construction background gave him a unique understanding of spatial relationships that translated beautifully to Braille instruction. His attention to detail, once focused on building safety, now ensured that every lesson was structured for maximum learning. "We're a good team, Daddy," Lucy had said one evening as they worked through a particularly challenging passage together. "Yes, we are, sweetheart," David replied, and for the first time in over a year, he'd meant it. By the time they moved to the Riverside apartments, a step down financially, but a step up in terms of community support, David had discovered something unexpected. Teaching Lucy had awakened abilities he didn't know he possessed. His construction background gave him a unique understanding of spatial relationships that translated beautifully to Braille instruction. His attention to detail, once focused on building safety, now ensured that every lesson was structured for maximum learning. When neighbors began asking for help with their own children or relatives facing vision loss, David realized he'd found a new calling. Not the career he'd planned, but perhaps the one he'd been meant for all along. The guilt never entirely disappeared. Some nights, he's still awake thinking about the crane operator who'd been fired, the families affected by the construction delays, the ripple effects of that terrible day. But Lucy's laughter as she successfully reads a new story, or the pride in elderly
Mr. Rodriguez's voice, when he managed to read his grandson's name in Braille for the first time, had slowly begun to heal wounds that surgery and therapy couldn't touch. David Fowler had lost his sight, his career, his marriage, and his home. But in learning to see the world through touch and sound and intuition, he'd discovered something precious, the ability to help others find light in their own darkness. As he prepared for Victoria Sterling's children to arrive that afternoon, David reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years ago, he'd been a man who prevented disasters. Today, he was a man who helped people rebuild after disaster struck. He had no way of knowing that this latest opportunity would test everything he'd learned about resilience, forgiveness, and the unexpected ways that broken people could help heal each other. The black sedan pulled up to the Riverside Apartments at exactly 2 p.m. Its pristine exterior a stark contrast to the weathered brick building and cracked sidewalks of Millbrook Heights. David heard the quiet hum of the expensive engine through his third-floor window, followed by the soft closing of car doors that spoke of quality engineering and careful maintenance. He'd been expecting them, but the reality of Victoria Sterling's arrival still caught him off guard. In the 3 hours since their phone conversation, David had tidied his modest apartment and arranged his teaching materials with extra care. Lucy had insisted on helping before school, organizing the Braille books by difficulty level and ensuring the folding table was positioned to catch the best afternoon light, a consideration that mattered more for his sighted visitors than for David himself. "Remember, Dad," Lucy had said before leaving for school, her wise 8-year-old eyes studying his face. "Some people need more time to feel safe. The twins might be scared." Now, as David listened to the unfamiliar sounds of footsteps ascending the narrow staircase, one set confident and quick, 2 smaller sets hesitant and careful, he found himself thinking about first impressions. In his construction days, he'd learned to read people quickly, to assess who would be reliable under pressure and who might need extra support. Those skills had translated surprisingly well to teaching, though now he relied on voice tones, breathing patterns, and the subtle ways people moved through space. The knock came softly, almost apologetically, despite the authority he'd heard in Victoria Sterling's voice earlier. "Miss Sterling?" David called out, making his way to the door with the practiced navigation he'd perfected over 3 years. "Yes, Mr. Fowler. Thank you for agreeing to see us." When David opened the door, he was immediately struck by the silence. Not just quiet, silence. In his experience, 7-year-old children, even those dealing with significant challenges, typically made some kind of sound: shuffling feet, whispered conversations, the rustle of clothing. But Emma and Ethan Sterling seemed to exist in a bubble of profound stillness. "Please come in," David said, stepping aside and listening carefully as they entered. 3 sets of footsteps crossed his threshold, Victoria's heels clicking confidently on the wood floor, followed by 2 pairs of what sounded like expensive sneakers moving with extreme caution. "Emma, Ethan?" Victoria's voice carried the practiced cheerfulness of a parent trying too hard. "This is Mr. Fowler, the teacher I told you about." David waited for responses that didn't come. In the silence that followed, he heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath, the sound of a mother's heart breaking just a little bit more. "Hello, Emma and Ethan," David said, crouching down to what he estimated was their eye level. "I'm David. I'm glad you're here." Still nothing. But David caught something else, the sound of small hands gripping fabric, probably Victoria's clothing. Fear had a sound of its own, and these children were radiating it. "Would you like to sit down?" David offered, gesturing toward the small seating area he'd arranged. "I made some cookies this morning. Nothing fancy, but Lucy, that's my daughter, she helped me make sure they actually taste good." For the first time, he heard a tiny shift from one of the children. Not words, but the slight movement that suggested interest, quickly suppressed. Victoria's professional composure was beginning to crack as she settled onto the couch, and he could hear her guiding the twins to sit on either side of her. They've been very quiet since the accident. she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. The specialists say it's normal, that they're processing trauma, but it's been 6 months, Mr. Fowler. 6 months of silence. David nodded, settling into his favorite chair and giving the family a moment to adjust to their surroundings. He'd learned that rushing trauma survivors often pushed them further into themselves. "Can you tell me about the accident?" he asked gently, directing the question to Victoria, but leaving space for the children to respond if they chose. Victoria's breathing became carefully controlled, the pattern David recognized from people trying not to cry. "We were in the car. I was driving back from their school's winter festival. It was snowing, and the roads were getting slick. A truck ran a red light and hit us on Emma's side of the car." David heard one of the children, Emma, he assumed, shift slightly at the mention of her name. "The impact was severe," Victoria continued, her corporate training helping her relay facts even as her mother's heart was breaking. "I had minor injuries, concussion, some bruises, but the children took the worst of it. Flying glass, debris. The doctors said they were lucky to survive, but the damage to their optic nerves was extensive. Complete bilateral vision loss." "I see," David said softly, though he immediately recognized the inadequacy of the phrase. "And since then?"
Since then, they've retreated completely. They were such vibrant, active children before. Emma loved to draw. She was incredibly talented for her age. Ethan was obsessed with building things, always had Legos or blocks scattered everywhere. They were learning piano, taking swimming lessons, constantly chattering about everything they saw and did. Victoria's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Now they barely speak. They resist learning Braille, refuse to use mobility aids, won't even try to navigate familiar spaces independently. The specialists say they're stuck in the anger stage of grief, but I think— She paused, struggling with the words. "I think they blame me." David absorbed this information, his mind already working through the layers of trauma these children were processing. Physical pain, sensory loss, survivor's guilt, and the complex emotions that came with having their entire world turned upside down in an instant. "Emma and Ethan," David said, addressing them directly for the second time, "I want you to know that everything you're feeling right now is okay. Being angry is okay. Being scared is okay too. Not wanting to talk is okay too." He paused, listening for any response, then continued. "I lost my sight 3 years ago in an accident too. Different kind of accident, but I remember what it felt like when everything changed all at once." This time, he distinctly heard one of the children, Ethan, based on the direction of the sound, turned slightly toward him. "The first thing I want you to know is that we're not going to rush anything today. We're not going to force you to touch things you don't want to touch or learn things you're not ready to learn. We're just going to sit here together, and maybe I'll tell you about some of the kids I know who've been through similar things." He reached over to his side table and picked up a small wooden object, a carved bird that Lucy had made for him in art therapy the previous year. "This is something my daughter Lucy made," David said, holding it gently. "She made it after she started losing her sight, too. Want to know what she told me about it?" For the first time since their arrival, David heard a sound from one of the children, a barely audible intake of breath that suggested curiosity. She said that before she started going blind, she would have painted this bird blue or red or yellow, colors she'd have seen. But when she made this one, she had to think about what a bird really is, the shape of its wings, the curve of its beak, the way its feet grip a branch. She said making it with her hands instead of her eyes helped her understand birds better than she ever had before. David set the carved bird on the coffee table where the children could reach it if they chose to. "Lucy also told me something else. She said that being scared is just your brain's way of trying to protect you from getting hurt again. But sometimes, when we're trying so hard to protect ourselves, we end up missing out on discovering what we're still capable of." Victoria had gone very still,
and David could sense her focused attention on her children's reactions. Here's what I'd like to suggest. Instead of a Braille lesson, what if we just talk today? You can ask me questions about being blind, or about Lucy, or about anything else you're wondering about. And if you don't want to ask questions, that's fine too. We can just sit here and I can tell you stories about some of the other kids I know who've been on journeys like yours. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had greeted him at the door. This wasn't the silence of fear or withdrawal. This was the silence of consideration, of children who were slowly beginning to trust that this strange man in this modest apartment might actually understand what they were going through. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 minutes, a small voice spoke. "Does it hurt?" The voice was barely above a whisper, but it was clearly Ethan's. "Does what hurt, buddy?" David asked gently. "Being blind. Does it hurt all the time?" David felt his heart clench at the raw pain in the child's question. "No," he said honestly. "Being blind doesn't hurt, but missing the things that you used to be able to see, that hurts sometimes. And being afraid of what comes next, that definitely hurts. Will we ever be happy again?" This time, it was Emma's voice, so soft that David had to strain to hear her. The question hung in the air like a prayer, and David felt the full weight of these children's trust settling on his shoulders. Victoria's sharp intake of breath told him that this was probably the most her children had spoken in months. "Yes," David said with quiet certainty, "you will absolutely be happy again. It might be a different kind of happy than before, but it will be real happiness. I promise you that." As the afternoon light shifted through his apartment windows, David Fowler began to understand that this first meeting was much more than just teaching Braille. These children needed someone who could guide them back to themselves, back to hope, back to the possibility that their lives could still be full of wonder and joy. And for the first time since Victoria Sterling's call that morning, David felt truly ready for the challenge ahead. The transformation began with something as simple as a cookie crumb.
2 hours into their first session, Emma had finally reached for one of David's homemade chocolate chip cookies. As she bit into it, a small piece fell onto the coffee table with the faintest sound. Without thinking, her fingers automatically searched for it, an instinctive movement that made Victoria's breath catch in her throat. "Emma just used her fingers to find something," David said quietly, acknowledging the moment without making it feel like a big deal. "That's exactly how I find things now, too." Emma froze, suddenly self-conscious about the natural movement she'd just made. "It's okay, sweetheart," David continued, his voice warm with understanding. "Using your hands to explore the world isn't something to be embarrassed about. It's actually pretty amazing what your fingers can tell you once you start paying attention." That tiny moment of unconscious adaptation told David everything he needed to know about what these children were capable of and what they were fighting against. Over the following weeks, as Victoria brought the twins for twice-weekly sessions, David began to see the full scope of their challenge. It wasn't just about learning Braille or developing mobility skills. Emma and Ethan were locked in a battle with their own potential, terrified that adapting to blindness meant accepting that their old selves were gone forever. Standard rehabilitation focuses on replacement skills, David explained to Victoria one afternoon, after the children had spent an hour reluctantly working with textured cards. Learn Braille to replace reading print. Learn to use a cane to replace visual navigation. But Emma and Ethan aren't resistant to the skills themselves. They're resistant to letting go of who they used to be. Victoria, who had been taking notes in a leather portfolio that probably cost more than David's monthly rent, looked up with the sharp attention he'd learned to recognize. "What do you mean?" "Emma was an artist, right? And Ethan was a builder?" "Yes, but they're not building or creating anymore because they think being blind means they can't. They think learning our techniques is like admitting defeat." David paused, organizing his thoughts. What they need isn't just adaptation training. They need to discover that they're still artists and builders.
They just need different tools. It was during their 5th session that David made a decision that would change the trajectory of all their lives. Ethan had been listlessly running his fingers over simple Braille letters, clearly going through the motions without any real engagement, when David suddenly stood up. "You know what? This isn't working," David announced, causing both children to freeze in surprise. "Mr. Fowler?" Victoria's voice carried a note of alarm. "We're doing this all wrong," David continued, moving to a storage closet Lucy had helped him organize the previous weekend. "Emma, Ethan, what if I told you that some of the most beautiful art in the world is meant to be touched, not seen, and that some of the most incredible buildings were designed by people who couldn't see them at all?" For the first time since that initial question about happiness, both children responded simultaneously. "That's not true," Emma said, though her voice carried more curiosity than conviction. "Prove it," Ethan added, with the first hint of his personality David had glimpsed. David smiled, pulling out materials he'd been saving for exactly this moment. Challenge accepted. What followed was unlike any rehabilitation session Victoria had ever witnessed. Instead of Braille letters, David introduced Emma to clay, not the sanitized therapeutic modeling clay from expensive rehabilitation centers, but real potter's clay that required her to feel moisture, texture, and resistance. Instead of mobility drills, he gave Ethan a collection of wooden blocks and challenged him to build a tower using only touch to ensure each piece was properly balanced. The sculptor Louise Bourgeois created some of her most famous works after she lost most of her vision. She said that her hands knew things her eyes never could. And there's an architect named Carlos Moran who designs buildings by constructing detailed tactile models first, then translating them to blueprints. Emma's fingers, which had been tentatively poking at the clay, began to move with more purpose. "Really? Really? Your fingers can detect differences in texture that are finer than what most people can see. They can sense temperature changes, air currents, vibrations. You've got tools your old artistic self never had access to." Meanwhile, Ethan was discovering that building without sight required a completely different kind of spatial awareness, one that was actually more precise than visual estimation. "I can feel when it's going to fall," he said wondrously, adjusting a block that David couldn't even tell was unstable. "It's like the tower talks to my hands." "Exactly," David said, settling back into his chair with the satisfaction of watching two children rediscover their own capabilities. "You're not learning to be different people. You're learning to be yourselves with superpowers." Victoria watched in amazement as her children, who hadn't willingly engaged in any adaptive activity in 6 months, spent the next hour completely absorbed in creation. Emma's small sculpture wasn't recognizable as any particular object, but her face showed the focused concentration that Victoria remembered from before the accident. Ethan built and rebuilt his tower with increasing complexity, narrating each decision as if he were an engineer solving a fascinating puzzle. But it was after the session, as Victoria was gathering her things to leave, that David made the commitment that would truly change everything. "Mrs. Sterling, I need to be honest with you about something."
2 hours into their first session, Emma had finally reached for one of David's homemade chocolate chip cookies. As she bit into it, a small piece fell onto the coffee table with the faintest sound. Without thinking, her fingers automatically searched for it, an instinctive movement that made Victoria's breath catch in her throat. "Emma just used her fingers to find something," David said quietly, acknowledging the moment without making it feel like a big deal. "That's exactly how I find things now, too." Emma froze, suddenly self-conscious about the natural movement she just made. "It's okay, sweetheart," David continued, his voice warm with understanding. "Using your hands to explore the world isn't something to be embarrassed about. It's actually pretty amazing what your fingers can tell you once you start paying attention." That tiny moment of unconscious adaptation told David everything he needed to know about what these children were capable of, and what they were fighting against. Over the following weeks, as Victoria brought the twins for twice-weekly sessions, David began to see the full scope of their challenge. It wasn't just about learning Braille or developing mobility skills. Emma and Ethan were locked in a battle with their own potential, terrified that adapting to blindness meant accepting that their old selves were gone forever. Standard rehabilitation focuses on replacement skills, David explained to Victoria one afternoon after the children had spent an hour reluctantly working with textured cards. Learn Braille to replace reading print. Learn to use a cane to replace visual navigation. But Emma and Ethan aren't resistant to the skills themselves, they're resistant to letting go of who they used to be. Victoria, who had been taking notes in a leather portfolio that probably cost more than David's monthly rent, looked up with the sharp attention he'd learned to recognize. "What do you mean? Emma was an artist, right? And Ethan was a builder?" "Yes, but they're not building or creating anymore because they think being blind means they can't. They think learning our techniques is like admitting defeat." David paused, organizing his thoughts. What they need isn't just adaptation training. They need to discover that they're still artists and builders. They just need different tools. It was during their 5th session that David made a decision that would change the trajectory of all their lives. Ethan had been listlessly running his fingers over simple Braille letters, clearly going through the motions without any real engagement, when David suddenly stood up. "You know what? This isn't working," David announced, causing both children to freeze in surprise. "Mr. Fowler?" Victoria's voice carried a note of alarm. "We're doing this all wrong," David continued, moving to a storage closet Lucy had helped him organize the previous weekend. "Emma, Ethan, what if I told you that some of the most beautiful art in the world is meant to be touched, not seen? And that some of the most incredible buildings were designed by people who couldn't see them at all?" For the first time since that initial question about happiness, both children responded simultaneously. "That's not true," Emma said, though her voice carried more curiosity than conviction. "Prove it," Ethan added, with the first hint of his personality David had glimpsed. David smiled, pulling out materials he'd been saving for exactly this moment. Challenge accepted. What followed was unlike any rehabilitation session Victoria had ever witnessed. Instead of Braille letters, David introduced Emma to clay. Not the sanitized therapeutic modeling clay from expensive rehabilitation centers, but real potter's clay that required her to feel moisture, texture, and resistance. Instead of mobility drills, he gave Ethan a collection of wooden blocks and challenged him to build a tower using only touch to ensure each piece was properly balanced. The sculptor Louise Bourgeois created some of her most famous works after she lost most of her vision, David told Emma as she hesitantly began shaping the clay. She said that her hands knew things her eyes never could. And there's an architect named Carlos Moran who designs buildings by constructing detailed tactile models first, then translating them to blueprints. Emma's fingers, which had been tentatively poking at the clay, began to move with more purpose. "Really? Really? Your fingers can detect differences in texture that are finer than what most people can see. They can sense temperature changes, air currents, vibrations. You've got tools your old artistic self never had access to." Meanwhile, Ethan was discovering that building without sight required a completely different kind of spatial awareness, one that was actually more precise than visual estimation. "I can feel when it's going to fall," he said wondrously, adjusting a block that David couldn't even tell was unstable. "It's like the tower talks to my hands." "Exactly," David said, settling back into his chair with the satisfaction of watching two children rediscover their own capabilities. Victoria watched in amazement as her children, who hadn't willingly engaged with any adaptive activity in 6 months, spent the next hour completely absorbed in creation. Emma's small sculpture wasn't recognizable as any particular object, but her face showed the focused concentration that Victoria remembered from before the accident. Ethan built and rebuilt his tower with increasing complexity, narrating each decision as if he were an engineer solving a fascinating puzzle. But it was after the session, as Victoria was gathering her things to leave, that David made the commitment that would truly change everything. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, using the formal address he'd maintained despite weeks of working together, "I need to be honest with you about something." Victoria looked up from helping Emma carefully pack her sculpture in a small box. "Yes? What Emma and Ethan need isn't something I can provide in 2-hour sessions twice a week. They need immersive experience, daily practice, and most importantly, they need to see. David caught himself and smiled at his own word choice. They need to experience other kids who are thriving with similar challenges. What are you suggesting? David took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to propose would require him to completely reorganize his life and expand his informal teaching practice beyond anything he'd ever imagined. I'm suggesting that I take them on, not just as students, but as a summer project. Daily sessions, field trips, exposure to other kids and adults who are living full, creative lives without sight. A complete immersion program that shows them what their lives could look like. Victoria's business instincts immediately kicked in. What would something like that cost? That's just it, David said, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. This isn't about money. This is about giving two kids their futures back. Emma and Ethan have the potential to do extraordinary things. They just need someone who believes in that potential enough to invest the time it really takes. Mr. Fowler, I couldn't possibly ask you to... You're not asking. I'm offering. Lucy's summer break starts in 3 weeks. What if Emma and Ethan spent their summer here, learning alongside Lucy and the other kids I work with? Not as charity cases or special projects, but as members of a community that's figured out how to build amazing lives that happen to not include sight. Victoria stared at him, clearly struggling to process what he was suggesting. You'd be willing to take on that kind of responsibility? To completely restructure your summer around my children? David thought about his conversation with Lucy the night before, when she'd asked why Emma and Ethan seemed so sad all the time. When he'd explained about their struggle to accept their new reality, Lucy had said something that stuck with him. Maybe they just need to see that blind kids can still be kids. Mrs. Sterling, 3 years ago, I thought my life was over because I couldn't see. Lucy taught me that I was wrong. I could still be a father, still help people, still make a difference. Now I have the chance to help Emma and Ethan learn the same thing. How could I not take that chance? Victoria looked at her children, who were still absorbed in their creations, displaying more engagement and focus than she'd seen since the accident. Emma was running her fingers over her sculpture with the same careful attention she'd once given to her drawings. Ethan was explaining to Lucy how weight distribution affected his tower stability, using concepts that showed his engineering mind was still sharp and curious. "What would you need from me?" Victoria asked quietly. "Just trust," David replied. "Trust that sometimes the best help doesn't come from the most expensive programs or the most impressive facilities. Sometimes it comes from people who've walked the same path and found their way to something beautiful on the other side." As Victoria watched her children actually laugh, for the first time in 6 months while Lucy taught them a clapping game that relied entirely on sound and rhythm, she felt something she hadn't experienced since the accident. Hope? "When do we start?" she asked. David smiled, already envisioning the transformation that lay ahead. "How about tomorrow?" Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to set over Millbrook Heights, casting long shadows through the apartment windows. But inside, 3 children and 2 adults were beginning to build something that would illuminate far more than any amount of natural light ever could. A community based on possibility, growth, and the radical idea that the best life might be the one you never planned but had the courage to embrace anyway. The transformation of David's modest apartment into a full-scale learning center happened gradually, then all at once. What began as moving furniture to create more workspace evolved into something that neighbors would later describe as magical, a place where children's laughter mixed with the gentle sounds of learning, where discovery happened as naturally as breathing. Within a week of Victoria's agreement to the summer program, David found himself coordinating the most ambitious project of his teaching career. The twins arrived each morning at 9, brought by Victoria herself, who had surprised everyone by adjusting her demanding executive schedule to personally ensure her children's transportation. She would return at 5 each evening, often finding Emma, Ethan, and Lucy so absorbed in their activities that leaving required significant negotiation. "I've never seen them like this,"
Victoria confided in David during the second week, watching through the window as the three children worked together on what Lucy called their secret project in the small courtyard behind the apartment building. Even before the accident, they were never this collaborative. I understand what you mean. Trauma had a way of either isolating people completely or bonding them in unexpected ways. Emma, Ethan, and Lucy had chosen the path of bonding, forming a trio that communicated as much through touch and shared understanding as through words. The daily routine David established bore little resemblance to traditional rehabilitation programs. Mornings began with what he called texture exploration, not the clinical exercises from therapy manuals, but genuine investigations into how different materials felt, sounded, and even smelled. Emma discovered that sandpaper could create different tones when scratched with various objects, leading to her creation of what she called feeling symphonies. Ethan found that different types of wood had distinct grain patterns that told stories about how the trees had grown, inspiring him to build structures that incorporated these natural narratives.
The key, David explained to Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a vision specialist who had begun consulting with him after hearing about his unconventional methods, is that we're not teaching them to adapt to a sighted world. We're teaching them to excel in a tactile world that has its own rules and advantages. Dr. Martinez, initially skeptical of David's lack of formal credentials, had become one of his most enthusiastic supporters after observing a session where Emma created a clay portrait of her brother that captured his personality in ways that visual art never could. "You're not just teaching skills," she told David. "You're teaching a completely different way of experiencing reality." This different way of experiencing reality extended beyond David's apartment into the wider community of Millbrook Heights. Local business owners, initially curious about the unusual activity in their neighborhood, had gradually become invested in the children's progress. Mrs. Chen, from the corner grocery store, began saving interesting textures, unusual fruits, different packaging materials, fabric samples for the children to explore. The elderly Mr. Rodriguez, who lived on the first floor, started teaching Ethan basic carpentry skills, marveling at the boy's ability to assess joint strength through touch alone. "It's like having three little scientists living upstairs," Mrs. Patterson from 2B told her grandson when he visited. "They're always discovering something new about how the world works." But it was the arrival of other children that truly transformed David's informal program into something extraordinary. Word had spread through networks of families dealing with vision loss, and by the third week of summer, David found himself coordinating activities for 7 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Each brought their own challenges and strengths, creating a dynamic community that pushed everyone to grow in unexpected ways. Marcus Williams, a 14-year-old who had lost his sight to juvenile glaucoma, became the group's unofficial technology expert, teaching the younger children how to use screen readers and voice-activated devices. 10-year-old Sophia Restrepo, born with congenital blindness, was a master of spatial navigation who could map unfamiliar buildings in her mind with remarkable accuracy. 8-year-old Jamie Chen, Mrs. Chen's grandnephew, had perfect pitch and was teaching everyone to identify locations and objects through their acoustic signatures. "What we're creating here," David told Victoria one evening as they watched the children engage in an elaborate game that combined building blocks, storytelling, and music, "isn't just a summer program. It's a demonstration of what's possible when kids with vision loss are encouraged to see their differences as advantages rather than limitations." The children's projects grew increasingly ambitious as their confidence soared. Emma's sculptures evolved from simple shapes to complex narratives told through texture and form. Her piece about the car accident, a work she created in secret over several days, depicted the moment of impact not as trauma but as transformation, with rough textures giving way to smooth ones, representing her journey from fear to acceptance. Ethan's buildings became architectural marvels that incorporated acoustic properties, temperature variations, and even airflow patterns. His masterpiece was a model of what he called a house for blind people,
a structure designed entirely around non-visual navigation, with different textures marking pathways, wind chimes indicating room purposes, and raised garden beds that provided both beauty and spatial landmarks. Lucy, thriving in her role as bridge between the newcomers and her father's teaching methods, developed into a natural mentor who seemed to instinctively know when someone needed encouragement and when they needed to be challenged. Lucy has the gift, Dr. Martinez observed. She makes everyone feel like they belong. The physical transformation of David's space matched the emotional transformation of its occupants. Donated materials filled every corner: clay and woodworking tools, musical instruments, fabric samples, building supplies, and an ever-growing library of Braille books. The acoustics of the apartment had inadvertently been optimized by the children's activities, creating distinct sound zones that helped everyone navigate independently. But perhaps the most significant change was in David himself. The tentative teacher who had begun the summer with careful lesson plans and structured activities had evolved into something more like a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of learning that seemed to generate its own momentum. His construction background proved invaluable in unexpected ways, not just for understanding spatial relationships, but for managing the complex logistics of coordinating multiple projects while ensuring everyone's safety and growth. "You found your calling," his sister Caroline observed during one of her weekly visits, watching David simultaneously help Emma refine a sculpture, troubleshoot Ian's acoustic engineering problem, and guide Marcus through a Braille transcription project. David paused in his activities, considering her words. 3 months ago, he was a struggling single father teaching basic Braille skills to neighbors. Now he was running what amounted to an alternative school that was attracting attention from vision specialists across the region. The transformation felt both gradual and sudden, like watching a photograph develop in slow motion. "The strange thing," David told Caroline later that evening, after all the children had gone home, "is that I feel like I'm finally using all my skills. The construction experience, the problem-solving, the attention to detail, even the leadership abilities I thought I'd lost. It's all here, just applied differently." As July moved towards August, David began to realize that what had started as a summer project for 2 traumatized children had become something much larger. Families were driving from neighboring towns to observe his methods. Dr. Martinez had begun documenting his approaches for potential replication in other communities. Victoria, meanwhile, had become an unexpected advocate, using her business connections to help other families access similar programs. "What happens in September?" Emma asked one afternoon, voicing the question that had been on everyone's mind as the summer program flourished beyond all expectations.
David looked around at the bustling activity in his apartment, children engaged in projects that would have been considered impossible for blind students just months earlier, families finding community and hope, a methodology that was proving its worth through daily demonstrations of success. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we're going to figure out something amazing." Outside, the late summer sun painted Millbrook Heights in golden light. But inside David's apartment, something even more luminous was taking shape. A vision of education that honored each child's unique potential while building a community strong enough to support everyone's growth. The question was no longer whether this approach worked, but how it could be sustained and shared with others who needed it. And, unknown to David, Victoria Sterling was already developing plans that would ensure the answer to that question would surprise everyone involved. The first sign that Victoria Sterling wasn't simply another concerned parent came on a humid Tuesday morning in late July, when David heard an unfamiliar rumble outside his building. Through his third-floor window, he could make out the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles arriving, not just Victoria's usual sedan, but something larger, accompanied by what sounded like several other cars. "Dad," Lucy called from the window, "there's a whole bunch of people getting out of cars downstairs, and Emma and Ethan are with them, but they look really nervous." David's stomach tightened. In his experience, when nervous officials arrived in groups, it usually meant someone had complained about his informal teaching program.
Despite the positive attention they'd been receiving, he always worried that running what amounted to an unlicensed school from his apartment might eventually attract the wrong kind of scrutiny. "Stay here for a minute, sweetheart," David told Lucy, making his way to the door as the now familiar sound of footsteps began climbing the narrow staircase. But these weren't just Victoria's confident heels and the twins' careful steps. There were at least 4 other adults ascending, their conversations muted but carrying the professional tone of business discussions. When David opened the door, Victoria's voice carried an apologetic tension he'd never heard before. "David, I'm so sorry to arrive unannounced like this. I know we agreed on normal session times, but something has come up that I need to discuss with you immediately." "Of course," David said, stepping aside, though his mind was racing. "Is everything all right with Emma and Ethan?" "The children are fine," Victoria assured him, but her tone suggested that fine was relative. "David, I need to be completely honest with you about something I should have told you from the beginning." As the group entered his apartment, David quickly counted voices and footsteps. Victoria and the twins, plus 4 adults he didn't recognize. The strangers moved with the careful courtesy of people trying not to disrupt an unfamiliar space, but their presence filled his modest living room with an energy that felt distinctly corporate. "Emma, Ethan," David said, crouching down toward where he estimated the children were standing. "Why don't you go show Lucy the new texture samples Mrs. Chen brought yesterday? I think there's something interesting from a pineapple that you haven't explored yet." As the children moved toward Lucy's area of the apartment, their relief at escaping the adult tension was palpable. David straightened up, directing his attention to Victoria and her companions. "David," Victoria began, and he could hear her taking a steadying breath. "My full name is Victoria Sterling, and I'm the CEO and founder of Sterling Technologies." The name hit David like a physical blow. Even someone who'd been out of the tech world for years would recognize Sterling Technologies, the company behind the adaptive software that had revolutionized accessibility technology for people with disabilities. Their screen readers, navigation apps, and Braille translation systems were considered industry standards. "Sterling Technologies," David repeated slowly, his mind reeling with the implications. "The company that makes the adaptive software that half my students use." "Yes," Victoria said, her voice small despite her corporate authority. "And these are members of our executive team. Margaret Chen, our Chief Technology Officer, Robert Harrison, our Director of Educational Initiatives, Jennifer Walsh, our Vice President of Product Development, and Dr. Michael Torres, our Chief Research Officer." David felt the room spinning slightly as he processed this information. For 3 months, he'd been working with the children of one of the most powerful figures in assistive technology, a woman whose company's mission was ostensibly identical to his small-scale teaching efforts. "I don't understand," David said, settling heavily into his chair. "Why didn't you tell me who you were? And why are they here now?" Margaret Chen spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the precision of someone accustomed to presenting technical information. "Mr. Fowler, for the past 6 weeks, Victoria has been sharing reports about your methods with our team. What you've accomplished with Emma and Ethan, and with the other children in your program, represents approaches to adaptive education that our research department has been trying to develop for over 5 years. We've been sending teams to observe similar programs across the country, spending millions on research and development, trying to understand how to create truly effective, immersive learning environments for children with vision loss. And here you are, in a 3-room apartment, achieving results that surpass anything we've documented." David turned toward Victoria, confusion and hurt evident in his voice. "So this was all research? Your children, their progress, you were studying us?"
"No!" Victoria's response was immediate and passionate. "David, no! Emma and Ethan's needs are completely real. Their transformation has been genuine. But as their mother and as someone who spent her career trying to solve exactly these problems, I couldn't ignore what I was witnessing. Dr. Torres cleared his throat gently. Mr. Fowler, may I be frank? We've observed your methods through Victoria's reports and Dr. Martinez's consultation notes. We've reviewed video documentation of your students' progress, with appropriate permissions, of course. What you're doing here isn't just effective, it's revolutionary. Revolutionary? David's voice carried disbelief. I'm teaching kids in my living room with donated materials and homemade lesson plans. Exactly, Jennifer Walsh said, her excitement evident. That's what makes it revolutionary. You've stripped away all the institutional barriers, the bureaucratic limitations, the preconceptions about what adaptive education should look like. You've created something organic, community-based, and individually responsive. Victoria moved closer to David's chair, her voice dropping to the personal tone he'd come to know over their months of working together. David, I didn't tell you who I was initially because I needed to know if your approach would work without the influence of corporate resources or expectations. I needed to see if the magic was in the method or just in the money. And now? David asked, though he suspected he already knew where this conversation was leading. Margaret Chen opened what sounded like a leather portfolio. Mr. Fowler, Sterling Technologies would like to offer you a position as Director of Community-Based Learning Initiatives. We want to help you scale your approach, create similar programs in communities across the country, and develop the resources to train other educators in your methods. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the children's voices from across the apartment, where Emma was excitedly explaining to Lucy how the pineapple texture reminded her of a sculpture idea she wanted to try. Scale it, David repeated slowly. You want to turn this into a corporate program? Not corporate, Victoria said quickly. Community-based, but with the resources to reach families who need it. David, there are thousands of children like Emma and Ethan who are struggling with traditional rehabilitation programs, families who can't afford private tutoring, communities that don't have access to specialized services. Robert Harrison leaned forward. We're not talking about institutionalizing your approach, Mr. Fowler. We're talking about supporting local educators to implement it. Training programs, resource allocation, community partnerships, all designed around your core philosophy of individual responsiveness and organic learning. David felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they were proposing. 3 months ago, his biggest concern had been whether he could afford to buy Lucy new Braille books. Now he was being offered the opportunity to influence adaptive education on a national scale. I need to understand something, David said finally. Victoria, when you brought Emma and Ethan here, were you looking for a teacher or were you conducting research? Victoria's answer came without hesitation. I was looking for hope, David. As a mother, I was desperate to find someone who could help my children. As a CEO of a company dedicated to accessibility, I was frustrated that all our resources and research hadn't produced the kind of breakthrough I was witnessing in this apartment. She paused, and David could hear the emotion building in her voice. The research aspect came later, when I realized that what you were giving my children could help thousands of other families. But it started with a mother who would have done anything to see her children smile again. Emma's voice carried across the apartment as she successfully completed a complex Braille reading exercise, her pride evident in her tone. Ethan was explaining to Lucy the architectural principles behind his latest building project, using vocabulary that would have impressed graduate students. What would this position involve? David asked, surprising himself by considering the offer seriously. Dr. Torres opened his own folder. The primary responsibility would be developing training curricula for community educators, establishing resource networks for local programs, and serving as a consulting supervisor for program implementation. You'd maintain your current teaching practice as a model site, but you'd also help create similar environments in other communities. The compensation, Margaret Chen added, would include a full salary, benefits, educational resources for your current and future students, and funding for community program development. We're not asking you to become a corporate executive, Mr. Fowler. We're asking you to become the architect of a movement.
As David sat in his modest apartment, surrounded by the evidence of what he'd built with determination and donated materials, he realized that this moment represented more than just a job offer. It was validation that his instinctive approach to teaching, born from his own struggle and his love for Lucy, had value beyond what he'd ever imagined. But it was also a test of everything he'd learned about what really mattered in education: relationships, community, and the careful attention to individual needs that couldn't be scaled up without losing its essential character. "I need time to think about this," David said finally. "Of course," Victoria said, relief evident in her voice. "Take all the time you need." As the Sterling Technologies team prepared to leave, David realized that his quiet summer of teaching had just become something much larger and more complex than he'd ever anticipated. The question now wasn't whether he could help Emma and Ethan. They were thriving beyond anyone's expectations. The question was whether he was ready to take on the responsibility of helping transform how the world approached adaptive education.
The decision to accept Sterling Technologies' offer came not through careful deliberation, but through a moment of clarity that arrived unexpectedly during a seemingly ordinary Thursday afternoon. David had spent 3 sleepless nights weighing the implications of Victoria's proposal, his mind cycling between the potential to help thousands of children and his fear of losing the intimate, community-based approach that made his program so effective. Then 8-year-old Marcus Williams, the boy with juvenile glaucoma who would become the group's technology expert, made an observation that changed everything. "Mr. Fowler," Marcus said during what was supposed to be a routine Braille lesson, "my cousin in Detroit just started losing his sight too. His mom called my mom crying because they can't find anyone who teaches like you do. She said all the programs there just make kids feel broken instead of helping them feel powerful." David paused in his instruction, struck by the simplicity and weight of Marcus's words. Here was a child who had transformed from withdrawn and angry to confident and helpful, concerned about another child facing the same challenges he'd overcome. The ripple effects of what they'd built in his small apartment were already spreading in ways David hadn't fully appreciated. "What do you think we should do about that, Marcus?" David asked. "Well," Marcus said with the matter-of-fact problem-solving approach that had become characteristic of all the children in the program, "obviously we should teach someone in Detroit how to do what you do. Then my cousin could have a program like ours." That evening, David called Victoria. "I want to discuss the position," he said without preamble, "but I have conditions." Victoria's relief was audible through the phone. "Name them." "First, this apartment remains my primary classroom. Any scaling of the program has to maintain the community-based, individualized approach. I won't be part of institutionalizing what we've built here." "Agreed," Victoria said immediately. "That's exactly what we want to preserve." "Second, Lucy and I stay in Millbrook Heights. I'm not moving to a corporate headquarters. This community is part of what makes the program work." "We can work around that. Most of the consultation work could be done remotely with periodic travel for training and program development." David took a deep breath before stating his most important condition. "Third, Emma and Ethan continue as regular students in my program, not as poster children for Sterling Technologies. Their progress is about them becoming the people they're meant to be, not about proving the value of corporate investment in education." There was a longer pause before Victoria responded, and when she did, her voice carried the warmth he'd come to associate with her role as a mother rather than her identity as a CEO. "David, that's all I've ever wanted for them. They're not marketing opportunities, they're my children. The fact that their healing has led to something larger is wonderful, but their well-being comes first." The transition from informal neighborhood teacher to director of community-based learning initiatives happened gradually over the following months. Sterling Technologies' approach to implementing David's vision surprised him with its thoughtfulness and restraint. Rather than immediately launching nationwide programs, they began with pilot sites in 3 carefully selected communities, each paired with local educators who spent weeks in Millbrook Heights observing and learning David's methods. Sarah Martinez from Phoenix was the first visiting educator, a former special education teacher who had lost her sight to diabetic retinopathy and was struggling to find ways to help her students connect with adaptive learning.
She spent 2 weeks in David's apartment, not just observing lessons, but participating alongside the children, learning to see education through their perspectives. The biggest difference, Sarah told David during her final day, is that you treat blindness as a different way of experiencing the world, not as a problem to be overcome. Your students aren't learning to cope with disability, they're learning to excel with different abilities. Kevin Thompson from rural Montana presented a different challenge. A former ranch hand who had been blinded in an agricultural accident, Kevin had natural teaching instincts but no formal educational background. His community was spread across vast distances, making David's apartment-based model seem impossible to replicate. "We need to think differently about what community means," David told Kevin during one of their strategy sessions. "In Millbrook Heights, community is physical proximity. In Montana, maybe community is families who drive 2 hours once a week to gather in your barn for intensive sessions, and then practice together through video calls during the week." The adaptation of David's methods to different geographical and cultural contexts required creativity that pushed both David and the Sterling Technologies team to think beyond their initial assumptions. Elena Rodriguez in South Texas developed a program that incorporated her community's bilingual culture, teaching Braille in both English and Spanish while integrating traditional crafts that had been passed down through generations of tactile learning. Her students were learning to read Braille through weaving patterns and pottery techniques that their grandparents had mastered without sight. Meanwhile, David's original program in Millbrook Heights continued to evolve and flourish. Emma and Ethan, now veteran students after 6 months of intensive work, had become natural mentors for newer children joining the program. Emma's sculptures had progressed from simple textures to complex narrative pieces that told stories through form and feeling. Local galleries had begun requesting displays of her work, not as inspiration-based charity exhibits, but as legitimate artistic expressions that happened to be created by someone who experienced the world through touch rather than sight. Ethan's building projects had caught the attention of architecture professors at the State University, who invited him to present his concepts for tactile-based design to graduate students studying accessible architecture. His ideas about using sound, airflow, and temperature variation as design elements were being incorporated into actual building projects. "The children aren't just adapting to their limitations," Dr. Martinez observed during one of her regular consultation visits. "They're innovating beyond what sighted children typically achieve." Emma's sculptures communicate emotional concepts that visual art often struggles to convey. Ethan's architectural thinking incorporates sensory elements that most designers never consider. But perhaps the most significant development was the growing partnership between David and Victoria that extended far beyond their professional collaboration. Their shared commitment to the children's success had evolved into a deep mutual respect and gradually something more personal. It began with small moments, Victoria staying after sessions to help clean up, bringing coffee during David's long planning sessions, asking his advice about parenting challenges unrelated to the twins' vision loss. Their conversations expanded beyond education and adaptive technology to discussions about life, loss, resilience, and hope. "I've spent my entire career trying to solve problems through technology," Victoria told David one evening as they watched the children engage in a collaborative music project that combined Ethan's acoustic engineering skills with Emma's rhythmic intuition. "But what you've taught me is that the most important innovations happen through relationships, not devices." David, who had initially been intimidated by Victoria's corporate success and financial resources, had come to appreciate her genuine commitment to improving lives rather than simply building profits. "You know what's interesting?" he said. "I used to think that losing my sight took away my ability to lead, to guide people towards solutions. But working with you and your team has shown me that leadership isn't about seeing what others miss. It's about helping others discover what they're capable of." The Sterling Technologies Board had initially been skeptical of David's unconventional background and methods, but the measurable success of the pilot programs was converting even the most conservative members. Test scores, independence assessments, and family satisfaction surveys all showed dramatic improvements over traditional rehabilitation approaches. More importantly, the children in David's expanded network were thriving in ways that couldn't be captured by standardized measurements. They were becoming leaders in their own communities, advocates for accessibility improvements, and examples of what was possible when education honored individual strengths rather than focusing on deficits. As winter approached and David marked his first anniversary as director of community-based learning initiatives, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. The apartment that had once felt too small for just him and Lucy now regularly hosted educational consultants, visiting families, and training sessions that sometimes included participants from 3 different states. But the most meaningful change was sitting at his kitchen table each evening as Emma and Ethan joined him and Lucy for dinner before Victoria picked them up. The 4 of them had developed the comfortable rhythms of a family, complete with inside jokes, shared responsibilities, and the kind of easy affection that made formal titles and corporate hierarchies seem irrelevant. "Dad," Lucy said one evening, using the casual tone that indicated she was about to make an important observation. "Emma and Ethan feel like my brother and sister now, and Miss Victoria feels like—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Like what, sweetheart?" David asked, though he suspected he knew what Lucy was thinking. "Like she belongs here with us," Lucy finished simply. As David listened to Victoria helping the twins with their homework in the next room, her voice carrying the patient warmth he'd come to cherish, he realized that Lucy was right. What had begun as a professional collaboration had become something much more personal and significant, a blending of families, purposes, and dreams that felt as natural as breathing. The question now wasn't whether their expanded program would succeed, but whether David was ready to acknowledge that his heart had grown to encompass not just the children he was teaching, but the remarkable woman who had brought them all together. The crisis began with a single article in the Technology Education Quarterly that questioned whether Sterling Technology's investment in David's community-based programs represented responsible corporate stewardship or expensive sentimentality. The article, written by Dr. Harrison Blackwell, a respected authority on educational efficiency, systematically dismantled everything David had built over the past 8 months. Community-based learning initiatives, innovation or indulgence, read the headline that Victoria discovered on a cold February morning. The article went on to describe David's methods as well-intentioned but unscalable, his results as anecdotal rather than scientifically rigorous, and his background as lacking the credentials necessary for educational leadership at this level. But the final paragraph would cut deepest. One must question whether Sterling Technology's significant investment in Mr. Fowler's programs represents genuine educational innovation or CEO Victoria Sterling's personal attachment to a tutor who helped her own children. The appearance of favoritism undermines both the company's credibility and the legitimate needs of the broader disability community. Victoria called David at 7 in the morning, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Have you seen the quarterly article?" "Dr. Martinez sent it to me an hour ago," David replied, settling into his kitchen chair as Lucy prepared breakfast with the careful movements of someone trying not to eavesdrop while clearly listening to every word. "I've read it twice." "David, I want you to know that this doesn't change anything. The board stands behind our programs, the pilot results speak for themselves, and—" David interrupted gently. "Victoria, does it change anything for you?"
The pause that followed was long enough for David to hear his coffee growing cold and Lucy's spoon scraping against her cereal bowl with unusual concentration. "What do you mean?" Victoria asked, though her voice suggested she knew exactly what he meant. "The article raises a fair question about whether my position is based on merit or on our personal relationship. Can you honestly say that if Emma and Ethan weren't my students, if we hadn't developed feelings for each other, that Sterling Technologies would have offered me this role?" Another pause, shorter this time, followed by Victoria's careful response. "David,
Your results with all the children, not just Emma and Ethan, demonstrate the value of your approach. The pilot programs in Phoenix, Montana, and Texas are showing measurable improvements in student confidence, independence, and academic achievement. That's not what I asked, David said softly. Before Victoria could respond, Lucy's voice cut through the tension in the kitchen. Dad, Emma and Ethan's car is here. David had almost forgotten that this was a regular teaching day, that despite the crisis brewing in the adult world, 9 children were expecting their usual morning of exploration and learning. As he heard the familiar sounds of the twins climbing the stairs, their voices calling out cheerful greetings to neighbors, David realized that the article's implications extended far beyond his own career concerns. Emma burst through the door with the confidence that had replaced her initial withdrawal, immediately moving to her favorite workspace where yesterday's sculpture waited for continued refinement. Mr. David, I figured out how to make the texture transition smoother. Wait until you feel this. Ethan followed close behind, carrying a carefully constructed model that represented his latest architectural concept. Dad, look what I finished. It's a playground designed entirely for kids who can't see. But I think sighted kids would love it too because it has all these cool sound elements and different surfaces to explore. David's heart clenched at Ethan's casual use of "dad," a term that had evolved naturally over months of shared dinners, homework help, and bedtime stories. The boy's unconscious assumption of their family connection suddenly felt fragile in light of the morning's revelations. Victoria arrived 20 minutes later, her professional composure intact, but her eyes showing the strain of the past few hours. "Good morning, everyone," she said with determined brightness. "How are the projects coming along?" As the morning session progressed, David found himself observing the children with new awareness of how their transformation might appear to outside critics. Emma's sculptures, which he saw as breakthrough artistic expression, could be dismissed as recreational therapy. Ethan's architectural innovations might be characterized as clever but impractical concepts. The collaborative learning environment he'd fostered could be reduced to unstructured playtime. "Mr. Fowler," Sophia Restrepo said during their geometry lesson, "my mom got a call from someone at my old school yesterday. They want to know if I'm ready to come back to regular classes since I'm doing so well here." David felt a chill of recognition. "What did your mom tell them?" "She said she'd think about it, but I don't want to go back. They never understood that I don't need to be fixed, I need to be challenged." Sophia's 10-year-old voice carried a wisdom that had developed through months of discovering her own capabilities. Similar conversations were happening throughout the morning. Marcus's parents had received a call from their insurance company questioning the continued necessity of experimental educational programs when traditional rehabilitation services were available. Jamie's grandmother had been contacted by a school district administrator suggesting that segregated learning environments might not be in the child's best interest for long-term social development. The coordinated nature of these inquiries suggested that Dr. Blackwell's article was part of a larger campaign to undermine David's programs. By mid-morning, Victoria was fielding calls from Sterling Technologies board members who were concerned about the company's exposure to criticism and wondering if a reassessment of the community programs might be prudent. "They're scared," Victoria told David during a brief moment when the children were engaged in independent work. "The board members aren't questioning the results, they're questioning whether defending unconventional methods is worth the potential damage to the company's reputation." David nodded, understanding the corporate dynamics even as they felt foreign to his own experience. "And what do you think?" Victoria looked around the apartment that had become a second home to her children, watching Emma guide a newer student through texture identification techniques with the natural teaching ability that had emerged over months of growth and confidence building. "I think," Victoria said slowly, "that I've spent my entire career building technologies to help people with disabilities integrate into a world designed for the able-bodied. But what you've shown me is that maybe we should be creating worlds that honor different abilities instead of trying to normalize them." Her voice was interrupted by the phone ringing. David answered to find Dr. Martinez's voice carrying unusual urgency. "David, I need to warn you about something. Dr. Blackwell is planning a surprise visit to your program tomorrow. He's coming with representatives from the State Education Department and the Federal Office of Special Education Programs. They're conducting what they're calling an independent assessment of your methods and credentials." David felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in that he'd experienced during his darkest days after the accident. What kind of assessment? "They want to observe a typical session, interview the children and families, and review your curriculum documentation." "David, I need to be honest. Dr. Blackwell has significant influence in federal education policy. If his assessment is negative, it could impact not just your Sterling Technologies position, but your ability to teach anywhere."
As David hung up the phone, he looked around at the informal classroom that had become the center of his world. Emma's sculptures lined the windowsills, each one telling a story of artistic growth and emotional healing. Ethan's architectural models occupied a corner table, evidence of engineering thinking that impressed graduate students. Lucy's carefully organized Braille library showed the systematic approach to learning that had inspired all of their teaching methods. Tomorrow, officials would evaluate whether this environment met their standards for educational excellence. They would measure David's credentials against traditional requirements, assess his methods against established protocols, and judge his results against conventional metrics. "Dad," Lucy said quietly, having listened to his phone conversation with the acute hearing that all the children had developed, "are they going to shut down our school?" David looked at his daughter, then at Emma and Ethan, who had paused in their work to listen, then at the other children whose families had trusted him with their most precious hopes for their children's futures. "I don't know, sweetheart," David said honestly. "But I know that what we've built here is real, and it matters, and it's helped all of you become the amazing people you're becoming. Whatever happens tomorrow, that can't be taken away." As the children returned to their projects with the resilience that had become their hallmark, David realized that the next 24 hours would determine not just his own future, but the fate of an educational approach that had proven its worth through transformed lives rather than standardized assessments. The question was whether that would be enough to satisfy evaluators who had never experienced the kind of learning that happened when children were encouraged to see their differences as strengths rather than limitations to be overcome. The official assessment began at precisely 9 o'clock on a gray Wednesday morning that felt heavy with impending judgment. Dr. Harrison Blackwell arrived flanked by 3 stern-faced officials whose clipboards and measuring devices seemed designed to reduce David's warm, organic learning environment to a series of checkboxes and compliance metrics. "Mr. Fowler," Dr. Blackwell said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to finding fault, "we're here to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of your educational methods, facility compliance, and student outcomes. We'll need to observe a typical lesson, interview students individually, and review your certification documentation." David nodded, though his heart was already sinking. The apartment that had felt spacious enough for 9 children suddenly seemed cramped and inadequate under the scrutiny of officials who were clearly comparing it to traditional classroom environments. Emma's sculptures, which had brought her such joy and pride, looked like therapy projects rather than artistic achievements. Ethan's architectural models appeared childish rather than innovative. "Where is your curriculum documentation?" asked Miss Patricia Hendricks from the State Education Department, consulting her tablet with the efficiency of someone processing a checklist. David gestured toward a modest folder containing his handwritten lesson plans and progress notes. "I maintain individual learning plans for each student, adapted weekly based on their interests and developmental progress." Dr. Blackwell examined the folder with barely concealed disdain. "These appear to be informal notes rather than structured curriculum guides. Where are your standardized learning objectives, your assessment rubrics, your compliance documentation with federal special education requirements?"
I focus on individual growth rather than standardized benchmarks, David explained, feeling increasingly defensive. Mr. Fowler, interrupted Dr. Robert Chen from the Federal Office of Special Education Programs, good intentions don't substitute for professional standards. These children deserve evidence-based interventions delivered by certified professionals. As the morning progressed, David watched helplessly as everything he'd built was systematically dismantled through bureaucratic criticism. His careful attention to individual needs was characterized as lack of structured programming. His use of community volunteers was deemed inadequate professional supervision. His emphasis on exploration and creativity was dismissed as recreational rather than educational. The children, sensing the hostile atmosphere, responded with uncharacteristic withdrawal. Emma, who normally bubbled with enthusiasm about her latest artistic discoveries, answered questions in monosyllables. Ethan's confident explanations of his building projects became hesitant and defensive under the official's skeptical questioning. "Can you demonstrate reading proficiency at grade level?" asked Miss Hendricks-Williams, ignoring the fact that his technological innovations had impressed MIT graduate students. "Are you receiving appropriate mobility training from a certified orientation and mobility specialist?" Dr. Chen demanded of Sophia, dismissing her natural navigation skills that had developed through months of confidence-building exercises. With each question, David felt the officials' predetermined conclusions becoming more apparent. They weren't here to evaluate the program's effectiveness. They were here to document its deficiencies according to predetermined standards that had nothing to do with the children's actual growth and happiness. The breaking point came when Dr. Blackwell pulled Emma aside for a private interview, ostensibly to assess her emotional adjustment to disability. David listened from across the room as the man systematically undermined months of healing with questions designed to highlight trauma rather than resilience. "Don't you think you'd be better served in a proper school with trained counselors and certified teachers?" Dr. Blackwell asked Emma, his tone suggesting there was only one acceptable answer. Emma's response was barely audible. "I like it here. But wouldn't you prefer to be with other children who can see? Don't you feel isolated learning with only blind children?" David watched Emma's confidence crumble under the weight of questions that reframed her community of friends as a limitation rather than a source of strength. When she began crying, the first tears he'd seen from her in months, something fundamental broke inside him. "That's enough," David said, moving to Emma's side despite the official's disapproving looks. "Emma, sweetheart, you don't have to answer any more questions." Dr. Blackwell's expression hardened. "Mr. Fowler, we're conducting an official assessment. Interference is inappropriate."
"What's inappropriate?" David replied, his voice shaking with controlled anger, "is making a child cry to prove a point about educational philosophy." The confrontation escalated quickly. Dr. Blackwell accused David of emotional manipulation and unprofessional conduct. Ms. Hendricks documented facility deficiencies that included the absence of institutional safety features and inadequate space allocation per student. Dr. Chen questioned whether Sterling Technologies' investment represented corporate responsibility or personal favoritism. By noon, the officials had compiled enough documentation to support whatever conclusions they'd arrived with before setting foot in David's apartment. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Blackwell delivered what felt like a final verdict. "Mr. Fowler, while your students may show affection for this program, affection isn't the same as educational effectiveness. These children deserve professional services delivered in appropriate settings by qualified personnel. We'll be recommending immediate discontinuation of these experimental programs and transition of all students to certified rehabilitation services." After the officials left, David sat in his kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of his morning. The children had departed early, their usual enthusiasm replaced by confusion and hurt. Victoria had been called away for emergency board meetings where Sterling Technologies executives were reassessing their community program investments in light of the official criticism.
For the first time since learning to navigate his blindness, David felt completely lost. The article in Technology Education Quarterly had questioned his credentials. The official assessment had dismissed his methods. Even Victoria's support was being characterized as personal bias rather than professional judgment. Worse than the professional humiliation was the damage to the children. Emma's tears had shattered months of carefully rebuilt confidence. Ethan's defensive responses had revealed how quickly his sense of belonging could be undermined. All of the students had been forced to question whether their growth and happiness were real or merely therapeutic illusions. Lucy found him there an hour later, still sitting at the kitchen table with his cold coffee and the weight of apparent failure. "Dad," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "Emma called. She wanted to know if we're still having art time tomorrow." David's throat tightened. "I don't know, sweetheart. The officials said our program isn't good enough. They think you'd all be better off in regular schools with certified teachers." Lucy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the thoughtfulness that had always been her hallmark. "Dad, do you remember what you told me when I first started losing my sight?" David nodded, remembering those terrifying early days when Lucy's world had begun changing in ways neither of them understood. "You said that just because something is different doesn't mean it's wrong. You said that my value as a person didn't depend on whether I could see like everyone else." "I remember." "Well," Lucy said with the simple logic that had guided their entire journey, "maybe our school is different too, but that doesn't make it wrong. And maybe those officials can't see what makes us special because they're looking for the wrong things." As David listened to his daughter's words, he realized that this crisis was forcing him to confront the same fears he'd faced after his accident. The fear that being different meant being less valuable, that needing accommodation meant accepting limitation, that building something unconventional meant building something illegitimate. What if they're right, Lucy? What if I'm not qualified to teach? What if I've been putting my own needs to feel useful ahead of what's actually best for you kids? Lucy reached across the table and found his hand with the precision that had developed through years of navigating by touch. "Dad, do you think Emma was happier before she met us or after?" "After," I admitted. "Do you think Ethan was more confident before or after learning to build things that work for blind people?" "After." "Do you think Marcus felt more hopeful about his future before joining our group or after teaching other kids about technology?" "After." Lucy squeezed his hand. "Then maybe those officials don't know how to measure the right things." As the afternoon light faded through the apartment windows, David sat with his daughter's wisdom and faced the hardest question of all. Was he willing to fight for what he'd built, even if it meant risking everything he'd gained? The officials would file their reports. The board would make their decisions. Victoria might be forced to choose between her company and her personal beliefs. Everything he'd worked for could disappear, leaving him once again alone with his blindness and his doubts. But Lucy's confidence and the memory of Emma's smile when she'd completed her first sculpture reminded him that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The question was whether he had the courage to keep believing in himself when everyone else seemed determined to prove him wrong. The breakthrough began with an unexpected phone call at 6 in the morning, 3 days after the devastating official assessment. David had spent those 72 hours in a fog of self-doubt, mechanically going through the motions of daily life while waiting for the inevitable notifications that would formally end his teaching career and dissolve the community they'd built. "Mr. Fowler?" The voice was unfamiliar, elderly, and carried the careful diction of someone choosing words with precision. "My name is Professor Eleanor Martinez, and I'm calling from the National Institute for Educational Innovation. I hope you'll forgive the early hour, but I've been up all night reading the most extraordinary research proposal."
David sat up straighter, his mind struggling to connect the dots. "I'm sorry, Professor Martinez, but I think you may have the wrong number. I haven't submitted any research proposals."
No, but Dr. Jennifer Martinez, no relation, submitted one on your behalf. She's documented your methods, student outcomes, and community impact over the past 10 months. Mr. Fowler, what you've accomplished challenges every assumption we've held about adaptive education. As Professor Martinez continued, David learned that Dr. Jennifer Martinez had been quietly documenting his approach since their first consultation. Her research proposal, submitted to the National Institute without David's knowledge, presented his community-based model as a revolutionary alternative to institutional rehabilitation programs. "The longitudinal data is remarkable," Professor Martinez explained. "Your students show measurable improvements not just in adaptive skills, but in creativity, leadership, and psychological well-being that far exceed anything we've seen from traditional programs. More importantly, Dr. Martinez has documented something we've never captured before: genuine joy in learning among children dealing with significant life transitions." David felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. What does this mean, practically speaking? It means, Mr. Fowler, that while Dr. Blackwell was conducting his assessment to prove your methods inadequate, the National Institute was simultaneously reviewing evidence that your approach represents the future of adaptive education. We'd like to offer you a federal research grant to formally study and document your methods. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Professor Martinez outlining opportunities that David had never imagined: federal funding for research, university partnerships for teacher training, congressional testimony on educational policy, recognition that could transform his grassroots program into a national model. But it was the timing of a second call, arriving just as David was processing the first, that truly changed everything. "David," Victoria's voice carried an excitement he hadn't heard since the crisis began. "Emergency board meeting in 2 hours. Can you be there?" "Victoria, I don't think that's—" "David, trust me. Just this once, trust me and be there." The Sterling Technologies boardroom intimidated David even more than the official assessment had. 15 executives in expensive suits sat around a polished table that probably cost more than his annual rent. Their attention focused on presentations displayed on screens he couldn't see but could sense through the room's technology-heavy atmosphere. Victoria introduced him with uncharacteristic formality. "Board members, I'd like you to meet David Fowler, whose program has just received recognition from the National Institute for Educational Innovation as a breakthrough approach to adaptive learning." Dr. Blackwell's report, Victoria explained, had indeed been damaging, but only until Professor Martinez's research proposal provided context that completely reframed the conversation. What Dr. Blackwell characterized as unprofessional methodology, federal researchers are calling innovative and responsive. What he dismissed as inadequate documentation, they're describing as authentic assessment focused on real-world outcomes rather than bureaucratic compliance. Margaret Chen, Sterling Technologies' Chief Technology Officer, spoke next. "David, we've been analyzing your approach from a systems perspective. What you've created isn't just an educational program, it's a scalable community-based innovation model that could transform how we think about adaptive technology development." Robert Harrison, the Director of Educational Initiatives, who had been present during the assessment, surprised David by becoming an advocate. "I spent yesterday reviewing video documentation of your students' progress over the past year. Emma's artistic development, Ethan's engineering concepts, Marcus's technology innovations. These aren't therapeutic achievements. These are examples of exceptional student performance that any educational institute would be proud to claim." But it was the presentation of unexpected support that truly shifted the room's energy. Victoria had been quietly gathering testimonials from families, community members, and professionals who had witnessed the program's impact. Mrs. Chen from the corner grocery store writes, "These children have brought such life to our neighborhood. They've taught all of us about seeing the world differently, and their confidence inspires everyone they meet."
Tommy Martinez, the man whose life David saved in the construction accident, drove here from 3 states away yesterday to provide this statement. David Fowler has always been someone who puts others' safety and well-being first. What he's doing with these children honors the same values that made him a hero on my construction site. The testimonials continued. University professors who had been amazed by the children's presentations, rehabilitation specialists who had observed the program and changed their own methods, former students from the pilot programs who are now thriving in mainstream schools while maintaining the confidence and creativity they developed in David's community. And finally, Victoria said, her voice dropping to the personal tone David had learned to recognize, I have a statement from Emma and Ethan Sterling, age 7, dictated to their mother yesterday evening. David felt the room's attention sharpen as Victoria continued. Mr. David taught us that being blind doesn't mean we can't do amazing things. It means we get to do amazing things in ways that other people haven't discovered yet. He didn't try to make us normal, he helped us become ourselves. We want other kids to have the chance to learn that being different can be beautiful. The silence that followed was broken by Dr. Torres, Sterling Technologies' Chief Research Officer. David, I need to ask you directly, are you willing to lead the expansion of this model beyond the current pilot programs? David thought about the children whose lives had been transformed, about Marcus's cousin in Detroit who was still struggling with inadequate support, about the hundreds of families Professor Martinez had mentioned who were seeking alternatives to institutional rehabilitation programs. What would expansion look like?
Margaret Chen opened her portfolio. Federal research funding through the National Institute. University partnerships for educator training. Community development grants for local programs. And a formal position as Senior Director of Adaptive Learning Innovation at Sterling Technologies, with resources to support similar programs nationwide. The board vote was unanimous, Victoria added quietly. We're not just supporting your approach, we're making it the foundation of our entire educational initiative going forward. As the meeting continued, David realized that what felt like his greatest failure had actually become his most significant validation. Dr. Blackwell's attempt to discredit his methods had forced a comprehensive examination that revealed their true value. The crisis that had threatened to destroy everything had actually created opportunities he'd never dreamed possible. But it was the personal conversation with Victoria after the board meeting that mattered most to David. I need to tell you something, Victoria said, as they walked through the Sterling Technologies campus toward her car. When Dr. Blackwell questioned whether my support for your program was professional or personal, it forced me to examine my own motivations. David braced himself for another revelation that might change everything. What I realized, Victoria continued, stopping beside a fountain whose water David could hear but not see, is that the personal and professional aren't separate. My children's transformation led me to recognize educational innovations that my company should support. But more than that, working with you has shown me what it means to build something meaningful with someone whose values align with your own. David felt his heart racing as Victoria continued. David, I don't want our partnership to be limited to Sterling Technologies. Emma and Ethan don't just see you as your teacher, they see you as their father. Lucy doesn't just tolerate having them around, she considers them her siblings. And Victoria paused, gathering courage, I don't want to be just your colleague or your student's mother. I want to be your partner in every sense of that word. Standing in the courtyard of a corporate campus that represented everything he'd once thought was beyond his reach, David realized that his journey from struggling single father to educational innovator had led him to something he'd never expected to find again, the possibility of love, family, and a future built on shared purpose. Victoria, David said, reaching for her hand with the confidence that had grown through months of learning to trust his non-visual senses,
I can't think of anything I'd want more." As they stood together in the afternoon sunshine, David understood that the breakthrough wasn't just about professional recognition or federal funding. It was about discovering that the community they'd built around the children had grown into something larger and more lasting. A family connected not by blood or tradition, but by the radical belief that everyone's potential deserved to be honored and nurtured. The crisis was over, but the real transformation was just beginning. The wedding took place on a Saturday morning in late September, exactly a year after Emma and Ethan had first climbed the stairs to David's apartment. The ceremony was held in the courtyard behind the Riverside Apartments, the same space where the children had spent countless hours discovering that creativity and confidence could flourish anywhere love and attention were present. Emma and Ethan, now 8 years old and radiating the self-assurance that had grown from months of celebration rather than accommodation of their blindness, served as ring-bearers. Lucy, in her role as maid of honor, guided them through their ceremonial duties with the natural leadership that had emerged as she'd helped other children navigate their own journeys of adaptation and growth. "Today feels like the beginning of everything," Victoria whispered to David as they stood before the small gathering of family, friends, and the extended community that had become part of their story. Mrs. Chen had closed her grocery store for the afternoon to attend. Tommy Martinez had driven from 2 states away to serve as David's best man. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, whose research documentation had saved our program, officiated the ceremony with words that honored both their personal love and their shared commitment to transforming how the world understood human potential. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Emma, speaking on behalf of all the children in their program, offered a blessing that brought tears to every adult present. "Mom and Dad, thank you for showing us that families can grow in beautiful ways when people care enough to see what's possible instead of what's missing." The reception that followed reflected the organic, community-centered approach that had made David's educational program so successful. Instead of formal speeches, children and adults shared stories about transformation, discovery, and the unexpected gifts that came from learning to experience the world through different senses. Marcus Williams demonstrated the voice-activated technology he developed for his science fair project. Sofia Restrepo led a group of sighted children through a navigation exercise that taught them to rely on sound and touch. Ethan presented his latest architectural model, a school building designed entirely around non-visual learning, to fascinated adults who were beginning to understand that accessibility could enhance rather than limit innovative design. The months following the wedding brought changes that exceeded even Victoria's ambitious business projections. The Fowler Sterling Community Learning Centers, as they became known, opened in 17 cities across the country, each one adapted to local culture and needs while maintaining the core philosophy that had emerged from David's apartment-based teaching.
Elena Rodriguez in South Texas had developed bilingual programs that taught Braille through traditional weaving patterns, creating connections between adaptive technology and cultural heritage that strengthened both. Kevin Thompson in Montana had established a network of ranch-based learning sites where children discovered that managing animals and understanding weather patterns were enhanced rather than hindered by heightened non-visual awareness. Sarah Martinez in Phoenix had created partnerships with local art museums, demonstrating that sculpture gardens and tactile exhibits could serve educational purposes that enriched experiences for all visitors. "What we're documenting," Professor Eleanor Martinez told David during one of their quarterly research review meetings, "is nothing less than a paradigm shift in how we understand learning differences. Your students aren't just adapting, they're innovating in ways that are influencing mainstream educational approaches." The federal research grant had expanded beyond its original scope as universities across the country began requesting training in David's methods. Teacher preparation programs were incorporating his community-based philosophy into their curricula.
Architecture schools were studying Ethan's designs for principles that could make all buildings more accessible. Art therapy programs were examining Emma's sculptures for insights into non-visual creative expression. But for David, the most significant changes were happening at home in Millbrook Heights, where the apartment that had once seemed too small for just him and Lucy now buzzed with the controlled chaos of a blended family that had expanded both by choice and by the natural magnetism of their approach to learning and living. Emma had claimed the small room that had once been David's office, transforming it into an art studio, where her sculptures had evolved from simple therapeutic exercises to complex artistic statements that galleries were beginning to request for exhibition. Her latest series, called Textures of Memory, explored how traumatic experiences could be transformed through creative expression into sources of strength and beauty. Ethan had converted the apartment's storage closet into what he called his engineering laboratory, where his architectural models had grown increasingly sophisticated. His designs were being reviewed by actual construction companies interested in buildings that incorporated sensory navigation principles. His concept for a playground that provided equal access and challenge for children with different abilities had been selected for implementation in the new Millbrook Heights Community Park. Lucy, now 9 years old and confidently navigating both her role as big sister and her position as mentor to newer students, had become David's unofficial assistant teacher. Her intuitive understanding of how to help other children overcome fear and discover their capabilities had led to invitations to speak at education conferences, where her insights often proved more valuable than those of adult professionals. Victoria's transformation had been equally dramatic. The corporate executive who had once managed her schedule in 6-minute increments now spent her mornings teaching business concepts to older students in the program and her afternoons developing policy recommendations for federal accessibility initiatives. Her experience as both a mother of children with disabilities and a technology industry leader had made her a sought-after advisor to government agencies and nonprofit organizations. "You know what's interesting?" Victoria said one evening as they sat in their expanded living room watching the children collaborate on a multimedia project that combined Emma's tactile art, Ethan's architectural concepts, and Lucy's storytelling abilities. "I spent my entire career before this trying to develop technologies that would help people with disabilities fit into a sighted world. Now I'm focused on creating communities where different ways of experiencing reality are valued and celebrated." David nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. His own journey from feeling broken and useless after his accident to becoming a recognized leader in educational innovation had taught him that the problem was never with his blindness, it was with a world that couldn't see beyond traditional assumptions about ability and limitation. The financial security that came with his new position at Sterling Technologies had allowed David to expand his vision beyond survival to legacy building. The apartment remained their primary residence and teaching center, but they'd also purchased the building, converting other units into specialized learning spaces and housing for visiting educators who came to study their methods. Mrs. Chen's Corner grocery store had become an unofficial extension of their program, where children practiced real-world navigation and social interaction skills while contributing to their community's daily life. The elderly Mr. Rodriguez had established a woodworking workshop in the building's basement, where students learned that creating functional objects with their hands provided both practical skills and deep personal satisfaction. "Dad," Emma said during one of their evening family meetings, where all 4 children participate in planning their program's activities, "Marcus's cousin in Detroit finally found a teacher who uses methods like ours. His mom called to say that he's building robots now and wants to become an engineer." David smiled, remembering the conversation with Marcus that had first convinced him to accept Victoria's offer to expand their approach beyond Millbrook Heights. Each success story like this one confirmed that their model could create ripple effects far beyond the children they worked with directly. As autumn moved toward winter, David reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that first desperate phone call from Victoria. He'd gained not just a wife and expanded family, but a sense of purpose that connected his personal healing to a broader mission of social transformation. The man who had once believed his useful life was over had become someone whose work was influencing national policy on education and accessibility.
The father, who had struggled to support just one child, was now helping to shape the futures of hundreds of children across the country. But perhaps most importantly, the community they'd built was proving that love, creativity, and mutual support could flourish anywhere people were willing to see possibilities instead of limitations, and that sometimes the most profound changes began with the simple act of one person taking the time to truly listen to another's needs.
5 years later, David Fowler stood in the same apartment where his extraordinary journey had begun, but the space had transformed in ways that reflected the profound impact his simple act of caring had generated across the world. The morning light filtered through windows that now overlooked the David Fowler Institute for Community-Based Learning, a purpose-built facility that had replaced the old parking lot behind the Riverside Apartments. Emma, now 13 and preparing for high school, was putting the finishing touches on her latest sculpture, a piece commissioned for the lobby of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization headquarters in Paris. Her work, which had evolved from therapeutic clay modeling to internationally recognized artistic expression, was scheduled to be unveiled at a conference on innovative approaches to inclusive education. "Dad," Emma said, her voice carrying the confident joy that had replaced her initial withdrawal. "The museum curator called again. They want to know if I'll consider a solo exhibition next spring." David smiled, remembering the terrified 7-year-old who had once sat silently in this same room, afraid to touch anything. "What do you think, sweetheart?" "I think," Emma replied, with the thoughtful consideration that had become her trademark, "that art should help people understand each other better. If my sculptures can show sighted people what the world feels like through touch, then maybe that's worth sharing." Across the room, Ethan was video-conferencing with a team of architects in Japan who were implementing his accessible design principles in their plans for the 2032 Olympic Village. His concepts, which had begun as childhood building projects in David's living room, were now influencing international standards for universal accessibility in public spaces. The key insight, Ethan was explaining to his colleagues across the globe, is that designing for different sensory experiences doesn't limit functionality, it enhances it for everyone. When you create buildings that communicate through texture, sound, and airflow, as well as visual cues, you're creating spaces that are more intuitive and welcoming for all users. Lucy, now 14 and serving as the Institute's youngest peer educator, was leading a training session for new teachers in the converted apartment next door. Her natural gift for mentoring had developed into a sophisticated understanding of how to help other educators implement community-based learning principles in their own contexts. "Remember," Lucy was telling her students, "we're not trying to fix children or make them normal. We're helping them discover their own unique strengths and teaching them that different doesn't mean less capable." Victoria emerged from what had once been David's small office, now expanded into a research center where she and her team documented the long-term outcomes of students who had participated in Fowler Sterling programs. The data they were collecting was reshaping not just educational policy, but fundamental assumptions about human potential and adaptation. "David," Victoria said, settling beside him on the couch where they'd first discussed expanding his informal teaching into something larger, "the longitudinal study results are remarkable. Children who participated in our programs 5 years ago are outperforming their peers, not just in adaptive skills, but in creativity, leadership, and academic achievement across all subjects." David nodded, though his attention was drawn to the sounds coming from the institute across the courtyard. Through the windows, he could see educators from 6 different countries working with local children, each group adapting his original methods to their own cultural contexts, while maintaining the core philosophy that had emerged from his desperate desire to help Lucy navigate her changing world. The ripple effects of their work had extended far beyond education for children with visual impairments. The Institute now hosted programs for children with autism, hearing loss, physical disabilities, and learning differences. The community-based model had been adapted for elderly adults dealing with age-related sensory changes, veterans adjusting to combat injuries, and immigrants learning to navigate new cultural environments. "Do you remember," Victoria asked, following his gaze toward the institute, "what you told me during that first phone call when I was looking for help with Emma and Ethan?" David thought back to that desperate conversation that had changed all our lives. "I said I wasn't a miracle worker, just a father who learned Braille alongside his daughter." "And now?" Victoria prompted, gesturing toward the bustling activity visible through their windows. Children laughing as they mastered new skills, educators discovering innovative teaching methods, families finding hope and community support. "Now, I think," David said slowly, "maybe miracles aren't about impossible things happening. Maybe they're about ordinary people caring enough to see what's possible instead of what's missing." The afternoon brought visitors that illustrated just how far their influence had spread. Dr. Patricia Williams, now Secretary of Education, arrived for her quarterly consultation on federal accessibility policies. Professor Chen from Harvard's Graduate School of Education came to discuss the new master's degree program in community-based adaptive learning that would train the next generation of educators in David's methods. But the most meaningful visitor was Tommy Martinez, the construction worker whose life David had saved 8 years earlier. Tommy now ran a nonprofit organization that created accessible playgrounds and community spaces inspired by Ethan's architectural innovations and funded through a partnership with Sterling Technologies. "You know what's funny?" Tommy said, as they stood in the courtyard where David and Victoria had been married, watching children from the Institute play on equipment designed according to universal accessibility principles. "That accident that cost you your sight and almost killed me, it was the worst day of both of our lives. But everything good that's happened since then grew out of what we learned from that terrible moment."
David considered Tommy's words as the afternoon progressed. The construction accident had indeed been devastating, destroying the life he'd planned and forcing him to rebuild his identity from the ground up. But that reconstruction had revealed capabilities and purposes he'd never known he possessed. His blindness hadn't made him a better teacher. His willingness to learn alongside Lucy and to see challenges as opportunities for growth had done that. As evening approached and the day's activities wound down, David found himself in the converted bedroom that served as the Institute's memorial wall. Photographs and testimonials from hundreds of families covered the space, each one representing a life that had been touched by the community-based approach that had grown from his modest apartment. There was Marcus Williams, now studying computer engineering at MIT, while developing assistive technologies for other students with visual impairments. Sophia Restrepo had become a mobility instructor who was revolutionizing orientation training through her integration of traditional techniques with confidence-building community engagement. Kevin Thompson's ranch-based program in Montana had expanded to include agricultural therapy for veterans dealing with PTSD. But it was the section dedicated to children who had died, some from the same genetic conditions that affected Lucy, others from accidents or illnesses that had claimed their lives despite the hope and growth they'd experienced in the programs, that reminded David of the deeper meaning behind their work. "We couldn't save them all," Victoria said softly, joining him in front of the memorial photographs. "But we gave them time to experience joy and accomplishment and belonging." "More than that," David replied, thinking of the families who had found comfort in knowing their children had been celebrated for their potential rather than pitied for their limitations. "We honored who they were instead of mourning who they couldn't be." As night fell over Millbrook Heights, David and Victoria made their way back to their apartment, where Emma was reading a Braille novel that would never have been available when David first lost his sight, where Ethan was designing buildings that would create more inclusive communities, and where Lucy was planning tomorrow's lessons with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered her calling early in life. The man who had once believed that losing his sight meant losing his purpose had become someone whose vision, not of what eyes could see, but of what hearts could recognize, was influencing policy, practice, and possibility around the world. "What do you think comes next?" Victoria asked, as they settled into their evening routine.
the comfortable domesticity of a family that had been chosen rather than inherited. David listened to the sounds of his children preparing for bed, to the gentle activity in the institute across the courtyard, to the wider community of Millbrook Heights that had embraced their unconventional approach to learning and living. "I think," he said, pulling Victoria close, "that we keep doing what we've always done. We pay attention to what children need, we believe in what they're capable of, and we create communities where everyone's gifts can flourish." Through their window, the lights of the institute cast warm patterns across the courtyard where so many lives had been transformed. Somewhere in Detroit, Marcus's cousin was probably working on his latest robotics project. In Montana, ranch children were learning that managing livestock required skills that enhanced rather than hindered their development. In South Texas, bilingual families were discovering that cultural traditions could strengthen rather than conflict with adaptive technologies. And in apartments and community centers and converted barns across the country, educators trained in David's methods were helping children understand that being different was not a limitation to overcome, but a perspective to be celebrated and shared. The ripple effect that had begun with a desperate father teaching his daughter to read Braille had become a movement that was changing the world understood human potential. But for David Fowler, surrounded by the family he'd never expected and the community he'd helped create, the most profound transformation was personal. The discovery that love multiplied when it was shared, that healing happened in relationship, and that sometimes the greatest gifts emerged from the deepest losses. Outside, Millbrook Heights settled into the peaceful rhythm of a neighborhood where miracles had become as ordinary as sunrise, and where every new day brought fresh possibilities for growth, discovery, and the simple joy of helping each other navigate the beautiful complexity of being human. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.